Allison,
Okay, I'm ready.
all right, Allison, could you give me, since you created the room, could you give me permission to record? Unless you want
Yes,
to record your end, but,
I'm recording it via Zoom too.
oh, okay. So if you'll do it, I won't do it.
Okay. Yeah, it's recording right now.
Okay, awesome. Um, well, we got a nice room full of people. All right. Well, let me introduce you and then we can get started. So welcome everyone to the second installment of the Mount Mercy University Fall Faculty Series. If you haven't watched the first presentation by Keisha Burke-Henderson, that is available on the Mount Mercy YouTube page. You should be able to find it pretty easily. Also, at the end of this presentation, you should be able to ask Allison questions either by the text chat or you can jump on the mic. And Allison, I don't know if you're controlling everyone's mute or everyone's microphone from your end, but if you are able to keep yourself muted, I guess, during the presentation, just so there's no background noise. And then we'll have some time to chat afterwards. All right, so our presenter, I am very pleased to introduce tonight live from your home office or someplace.
I'm in quarantine in Iowa City.
Oh, all right, that's not too bad. All right, so Allison McNeese. Allison has taught history at Mount Mercy for 30 years, and she has had a passion for teaching about gender and race issues. She offers a portal course, which is an introductory freshman course called Law Ungendered, and it focuses on the struggle for women's suffrage in the United States. And she enjoys engaging students on that topic. Allison takes a special interest in the role that Iowa played, or in the role played by Iowa and its citizens in winning the vote for women, and I think she's going to tell us a little bit about that tonight. So Allison, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to address you in this mode as well as just generally. I would like to tell you that I have 2 dogs in the room with me. I will mute myself if they begin to bark. I will apologize in advance. They like to comment on passing traffic, and I have tried different methods of shutting them in different rooms or shutting myself in a room, and they still make noise to try to get to me. So in my afternoon class today, I had a great big cross between a standard poodle and an Irish setter repeatedly trying to lick me in the face while I was addressing my students. So it's all good. I just wanted you to know that we might have a little interruption. So I'm going to check from time to time the chat function to see if you have questions. I'll also stop and talk and stop talking and ask if you have questions as well. I'm going to share my screen, and this will be recorded too. Let's see if I can bring that up. My presentation focuses on suffrage in Iowa, but I decided I was thrilled to listen to and watch Keisha's presentation. I thought maybe it would be helpful to give you a little bit of an overview of the entire suffrage movement, just so you know where Iowa's events fit in. So we're going to focus on the women's suffrage movement in Iowa, as my title suggests. But I'm going to devote the first maybe 5 to 10 minutes to helping you understand the context of this. So I'm going to try not to be too detailed in that. But as Joe told you, I teach a course on suffrage, Law Ungendered, and it is one of my passions, and it's kind of hard to shut me up. So I'll do the best I can to keep this brief in terms of introduction. So a little bit of background about suffrage in general. Even at the time that our nation was founded in the 1780s and 1790s, there were women's voices that clamored for recognition and education and opportunities. The 2 women that you see pictured on the screen now are Abigail Adams, the wife of our 2nd president, the mother of our 6th president, John Quincy Adams, in the 1820s. She's fairly well known for writing her husband when he was at the Continental Congress to remember the ladies. And this was John and Abigail Adams wrote thousands of letters in their married life together, but this is a particularly memorable one. There's a little bit of joking back and forth in their letters about this, but it's pretty clear from the context that she was serious, that she wanted her husband to acknowledge women's needs and their participation both in the revolution and in the founding of the new nation. The other woman who's pictured is Judith Sargent Murray, who wrote in the 1780s and 1790s about the need to educate women, not in a kind of decorative or ornamental way, which was sometimes the case, but in a serious way so that they could participate in the Republic. A University of Iowa now retired Professor Emeritus Linda Kerber has coined a term called Republican motherhood. I don't know how many of you are political science junkies, but you may know that throughout human history, republics have been considered to be very, very dangerous, shaky, vulnerable entities, largely because republics depend on their citizenry to be active and participatory. And we see this in our own culture, that we often have elections where fewer than 50% of registered voters participate. Sometimes it drops very low. And so the need of these women and those that they represented argued for women to be educated as fully citizens, if for nothing else, to raise future Republican sons who would be active and participatory citizens. What I tell my classes often is, you just couldn't afford to have ditzes, as mothers in this vulnerable new republic. So that will be a concept that will bleed into the early 1800s, the 19th century. And women will begin to be offered more equal educational opportunities, which will lead them outside of their private home spheres into reform movements. And probably the most, well, I won't even say probably, the most prominent reform movement in the early 19th century, you probably would recognize as the need to abolish slavery. And so literally thousands of women became involved in abolition societies in this country and elsewhere. But there were other reform movements as well. Suffrage will become one of them eventually. But moral reform, education reform, prison, asylum reform, even just reforms in the way people structured their lives in communities. So the early 19th century will be a virtual hotbed of both women and men getting involved in ways that they could improve their country. Jane Addams, later in the century, you probably will recognize her name as the founder of Hull House in Chicago in 1889. She's also the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. But she would call this municipal housekeeping. And basically, and this is a little later in the century, but she would essentially argue that if women are supposed to be good at keeping their homes clean, keeping their children disciplined and straight, they can do those same things outside their home in a municipal sense. So they can be active in keeping their streets clean and free of crime. They can be active in curbing juvenile delinquency or crime. And so this will be, by the end of the century, something that will be fairly commonly accepted as a means by which women can contribute to their society. I did want to tell you that the early 19th century began to see the first equal opportunity educations in our nation. In 1836, Oberlin College in Ohio was the first private college to allow women to study the same subjects, to get an equal education as males. I used to stop there in my classes, but I read an article not too long ago with a little footnote that said that there was some difference in the way male and female students were treated at Oberlin. Males did not have to do dishwashing and washing clothes and cooking meals, while female students, although they got the same education, were required to do those kinds of, again, housekeeping duties. But the first public institution, the first state institution in the nation to allow women to study equally to men is our own University of Iowa. And you may know, I'm going to try to move this up a little bit, that Iowa became a state in December of 1847. Within 3 months, actually within 2 months, within about 60 days, the new legislature passed an act that would create a state institution of higher learning. Now, there was a process of about 8 years before students matriculated or began their education at the University of Iowa. But in that first year, there were 124 students and 41 of them were women. So we have a place in national history in terms of equality of education that I think we can be proud of. Now, I said I would stop from time to time and check chat or stop and see if you have a question. All right, then I will continue. So, let this. I wanted to give you a little bit of a timeline of national suffrage. And again, I'm trying to restrain myself here. I will spend most of my time on events in Iowa. But Keisha talked about the first Women's Rights Convention in July of 1848, July 19th and 20th in Seneca Falls, New York. This was the first Women's Rights Convention in our country. Women planned this, primarily Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a young matron and mother, and someone she had met in London on her honeymoon, Lucretia Mott, a Quaker from Philadelphia, who was interested in the woman question. On July 19th, the convention allowed women only to join. On the 20th, men and women were welcome, and more than 300 people actually showed up for this. It's the first kind of organized demand for suffrage. It dealt with other issues besides suffrage, but it's particularly notable because Elizabeth Cady Stanton had prepared a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. And I have always thought it was a very clever parody, for lack of a better word, on the Declaration of Independence. If you've read that document, which I hope you have as a historian, Thomas Jefferson had some very elegant language where he talked about all men being created equal. Then he blamed George III, the King of Britain, for 18 different grievances. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton used that same language. She added men and women being created equal, and her 18 grievances were against man. So sometime it's in the public domain. It's a kind of interesting document. It should have been very familiar to American citizens 72 years after the Declaration had been published. So it would have hit a kind of a familiar note. Between 1849 and 1861, up until the Civil War, there were similar women's rights conventions somewhere in the nation every year. Some of them were organized by the same people. There was only one year that there was no women's rights convention. That was 1857. We were having a kind of micro civil war over what was called Bleeding Kansas in that period in 1856 and 1857. And I've always assumed that national attention was on that. But everywhere, somewhere in the nation, between 1849 and 1861, there was a similar convention as the one in New York. And this is a little bit interesting to me because most reformers, even those who were sympathetic to women and their own needs, had encouraged women to stand back, to put their own issues on a back burner until abolition was achieved. And I think it's interesting that there must have been enough passion here that despite that discouragement, even from like-minded people, these conventions continued to build. Most of this activity stopped in the years of the Civil War for what I hope are obvious reasons. Most of the nation focused on the need to preserve the Union and then bring it back together. So there was not a whole lot of women's rights activities. There was a little, but not a whole lot in that period. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified. And I always like to make sure my own students know that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves. It was an economic threat by Abraham Lincoln in 1862 and 1863 to deprive Southerners of their slave property if they didn't cease and desist their rebellion. So he threatened it in September of 1862. He made good on it in January of 1863, but the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the South where the Confederacy was still in control. It did not affect slaves who were under Union control territory in the South. So it's in December of 1865, months after President Lincoln's assassination, that the 13th Amendment freed slaves across the board. However, it did not say what the former slaves were. There was so much chaos in this country that historians really don't even know how many slaves were freed by the 13th Amendment. They estimate between 3 and 4 million. That's a pretty big gap. But what these former property now were is not defined by the 13th Amendment. It's three more years before citizenship is defined. However, women see this as an opportunity, and a national organization, the ERA, it's usually abbreviated, not Earned Run Average, I tell my baseball students, but the Equal Rights Association was formed to take advantage of now having what they believed to be a clear path after abolition had been achieved. Then in 1868, 3 years after the 13th Amendment, the 14th was ratified, and it defined citizenship in the second plank of that amendment as male. And boy, did this cause a crisis. Women who felt like they had been led on by Republicans, particularly in the Republican-dominated Congress, had been betrayed. And so there is a lot of controversy over that word male in the 14th Amendment. I will tell you too, Keisha referred to this as well, there's a good bit of ugly racist attitudes that come out of this, as white women were incensed at the idea that African-American men, recently slaves, were citizens and they were not. So there's really an unfortunate period of division and really ugly stereotyping here that I wish passionately could have been avoided. As a result of this controversy over the 14th Amendment, the ERA, that national organization, split after only having been formed for about a year and a half. And there are two organizations, one that's relatively conservative and one that's relatively radical. The American Women's Suffrage Association is the relatively conservative one. It let men in. It focused on gradual persuasion, and it focused only on suffrage. The National Women's Suffrage Association refused to let men in, did not limit itself just to suffrage, and wanted a lightning strike, a federal amendment or law, constitutional amendment or federal law immediately. And those two organizations will remain separate for 21 years. They don't accomplish very much separately. So by 1890, they come back together. We'll talk about that again as NAWSA. At least there's a pronounceable acronym there, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. In 1870, the third of what are called the Reconstruction Amendments. Hey, GQ, how about if you mute? That's okay. All right. 1870, the third of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 15th Amendment, clearly connected the right to vote to citizenship. It had been implied in the 14th Amendment, but this did clarify that once and for all. And this is going to be good news for some women who are going to argue, just kind of forget about the 14th Amendment, and they're going to say, we are too citizens, and the 15th Amendment says we have the right to vote. Not going to work out that well, but still. Now let me stop for just a second. This is taking longer than what I timed it as, but I'm not seeing anything in chat. Does anybody have a question? Okay, back to this. There's not too much more by way of introduction. So continuing the timeline, in 1872, Susan B. Anthony is one of those American women who says, "I am too a citizen, and the 15th Amendment gives me the right to vote." She organized a group of women, including her elderly mother and her sisters, and they basically forced a local registrar to let them register. And she took a group of women in Rochester, New York, to vote in November of 1872. She was arrested 2 weeks later by a federal marshal. She asked to be handcuffed. He refused to do that, for knowingly voting without a legal right to vote. And she was tried in 1873. According to records, the judge came into the trial with his decision already in his coat pocket. There's a really interesting write-up in the New York Times about this whole trial. He kept trying to shut her up. He did make the mistake, though, of asking her after she had been declared guilty if she had anything to say, and he just was not effective in getting her to sit down. But she was arrested and tried for voting. And I think this is a kind of an irony, given the dangers of having a lack of an active citizenry. Here she is participating in her government, and her government arrests her. So that is a notable landmark. In 1875, there was a Supreme Court decision that came down about a Missouri woman, Virginia Minor, who had tried to register to vote, and Reese Happersett, the registrar of voters in her Missouri district, refused to let her vote. And so her husband sued on her behalf, and the Minor versus Happersett decision decided against her. And 3 judges used language in their opinions that talked about how, yes, women were citizens, but they were divinely ordained for the home, and they were timid and unable to participate in public affairs. So again, you might want to read the 14th and 15th Amendment to see how logical you think that decision was, but it was a blow against women being able to vote. In 1878, a California senator, Aaron Sargent, introduced what was known then as the Anthony Amendment in the U.S. Senate for consideration. It's not an accident that he was from a Western state. Western territories and states generally allowed more privileges for women. They wanted to grow their populations, and that requires women. So Aaron Sargent also was, his wife, Ellen, was a very close friend of Susan B. Anthony. What was known as the Anthony Amendment at the time becomes, with just a little bit of revision, the 19th Amendment that we're focusing on. I will tell you that you probably know that when an amendment or a bill is offered on the floor of the Senate or the House, it's referred to a committee that studies it and then reports back, kind of yes or no. That doesn't bind anybody to vote that way, but some groundwork is done. The Anthony Amendment was sent to the Committee on Public Lands, where it was stuck for some 8 years. It was voted on and defeated soundly in the U.S. Senate in 1886. In 1890, we've already talked about NASA merging. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the first president of that merged organization. By 1896, there had been a little action. 4 Western states, Wyoming was the first. As a territory in 1869, it had allowed women to vote. Colorado in 1893, Utah and Idaho by 1896 had allowed women the franchise. So there's a little bit of movement there. But by this time, the end of the century, that older generation that I've talked about, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and others, had begun to die off. Or they were elderly. Stanton would die in 1902. Anthony dies in 1906 without seeing their goal achieved. And there's a new generation, and we're going to talk about both generations in Iowa as well. The younger generation tends to be college educated, more in our contemporary usage, maybe more liberated. And you're going to see some different tactics after 1900 as a result. Between 1910 and 1913, 11 more states add suffrage for women in one degree or another. In some areas, it was just to vote for president. Illinois, for instance, allowed women to vote for the top national office. But by 1913, there were 15 states in the Union that allowed women to vote. But by 1913, NAWSA split again. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this, but NAWSA stays under the control of an Iowa woman. We're going to talk more about Carrie Chapman Catt and what evolves as the National Woman's Party under the leadership of Alice Paul. They split. And again, NAWSA will be the relatively conservative organization, the National Woman's Party, relatively radical organization. Having said that, I want to tell you that no one, male or female, who was standing up in the 1860s or the 19-teens and demanding the right to vote for women can really be considered a conservative. So it really has to do more with their tactics and how they go about working for the same goal. I'm going to stop one more time. We don't have much more for introduction, and I'm sorry, I'm going to mute too.
You're muted, Allison.
I think she might be dealing with the aforementioned dogs, I think.
I should have offered her my daughter to take care of, though.
There was a dog passing in front of the house, and both Trudy and Lucy feel the need to comment. There were two questions in chat, so I wanted to address those. One was, did the racism in the movement hold it back? Undoubtedly. In fact, every split, whether it was along tactical lines or due to racial division, held the movement back. We're going to talk about particularly African-American women in Iowa who contributed to the movement in tremendously significant ways. But I don't think anybody would argue that this was not a devastating development. And it taints the entire movement. And Keisha, I think, addressed that in her talk. The second question was, why would they send it to the Committee of Public Lands? Well, it's because they wanted to lose it, all right? This is an all-male Senate. They don't want women to vote, generally speaking. There were a few exceptions, but the vast majority of male senators did not want to share power. So this was a way of burying it for a while. Let me ask if I answered those questions, or if you have another follow-up, let me know. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead, try to get through this. All right. Okay, so a little bit more on the timeline. In August 1914, the Great War, it wasn't called World War I then, there hadn't been a second one, began. And in April of 1917, 2.5 years after it began, we entered the war. Now, I just wanted to show you some very quick slides about how this is significant in the suffrage movement, because women are going to be needed in the war effort. And so I'm just showing you some posters, propaganda posters by the Committee on Public Information about women's skills that are needed, or their need to buy more savings bonds or stamps, grow food. There are posters that show that they're needed in the military. Some really colorful posters. There's a group of Navy women, and I couldn't resist, I know I don't have much time to do this, but to show you a picture of the first two women who joined the Coast Guard. They were twin sisters from Brooklyn, New York, and I just could not help but share what I'm sure was a propaganda picture of two what were called Yemenettes in the U.S. Navy, Mutt and Jeff. And I've always gotten a kick out of that. And I'm sure it was intended to induce humor. In addition to general war needs, women were needed as signal corps operators and as nurses. And I could give you a lot more information about these jobs by the end of World War I. I'm calling it World War I, the Great War. We had 12,000 newly trained professional nurses. So this was a major advance in women's opportunities and the need for women work. So suffrage becomes a war measure. President Wilson had not wanted to favor suffrage. He once told a suffrage delegation that this was a matter that he had never been confronted with before. I've always found that a little hard to swallow since he had a PhD in political science and two of his own daughters were suffragists. Also, he had been the president of a women's college where there was an active suffrage movement, but he is convinced through the need to unite the country in the war effort to throw his support to suffrage. So the next development is that President Woodrow Wilson addresses a joint session of Congress and asks both houses of Congress to pass what was then known as the Anthony Amendment, which becomes the 19th Amendment. In January that same month, the House of Representatives does vote for suffrage. And I've read very moving accounts of that vote. Women from both of those groups packed the galleries in Congress. Men came from their wives' deathbeds on their request to vote for suffrage. There were a lot of personal dramatic stories. Jeanette Rankin, who was the first woman to be elected to the House of Representatives from Montana, cast her vote for suffrage. And it's said that when the final tally had come and it was clear that the House had passed the amendment, that the women were completely silent and filed out of the Capitol, where someone began singing the doxology. Praise God from whom all blessings flow, and all of these women joined in. So it was a very moving moment. I got chill bumps when I talk about that. It takes another year and a half for the more conservative body, the Senate, to vote for suffrage in June of 1919. And then it goes to the states. 36 out of then 48 states had to ratify. And on August 18th, after a 10-day drunken, raucous special legislative period, Tennessee ratified as the 36th state. There's an excellent film on Films on Demand, to which we have a subscription, called Perfect 36. It's only 25 minutes long, I think, and it is a fascinating story. One of the reasons it's fascinating is that one of the youngest legislators in the House, Harry Boone, was committed to voting against suffrage. He got, accounts vary, a letter or a telegram from his mother, Miss Phoebe Boone, where she told him to be a good boy and vote for Mrs. Catt, and he changed his mind and he put that amendment over in Tennessee. So there he is with triumphant pro-suffrage supporters on the steps of the Tennessee Capitol. On August 26, in 1920, the 19th Amendment officially became part of the Constitution, and that is the date that we still celebrate as Women's Equality Day here in the country. So that's the introduction. Again, it took longer than when I timed it, but I see a chat question. I didn't see that article, but it doesn't matter. Okay. All right, any questions before I go straight to Iowa? Finally. Okay, and I did pare down a lot of the Iowa information just in case, but there's a ton of really fascinating stuff out there about Iowa's contributions. In fact, I teach Iowa history too, and it's amazing how much Iowa has contributed nationally in virtually every era. For instance, the first male and the first female deaths in the Great War were Iowans, Merle Hay and Marion Crandall, since we mentioned the Great War. But I wanted to start in the 1850s, which is when we had newspaper accounts of a suffrage activist delivering lectures in Iowa. Frances Dana Gage had organized, she was originally from Ohio. By this time, she had moved to Missouri, where she continued to work as an avid abolitionist. And she had death threats in Missouri. I don't know if you know that Missouri sent 22 regiments to the Union and 27 regiments to the Confederacy in the Civil War. It was a very divided border state. And so in the 1850s, her life was in danger for continuing to advocate for abolition. She had organized a women's rights convention in Ohio in 1850. She was at the Akron, Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851 when Sojourner Truth stood up and gave that speech that Keisha so eloquently described in her presentation. I hate to tell you this, but it's Gage's account of Truth's statements that are the most controversial and have stuck with. Keisha addressed this in her talk. But it's Gage's description of Truth's dialect and language that have caused some controversy. But here's an article in the Muscatine paper. And we know that she gave lectures in Keokuk and in Fairfield, and probably in other places as well. But we see suffrage activism in Iowa as early as 1854. Amelia Jenks Bloomer is a name that you may have heard before. She's well known because she popularized a costume that she didn't invent, but she wrote about a lot. She was originally from New York, but she and her husband moved to Iowa, settled in Council Bluffs by either 1854 or 1855. Accounts vary. She had begun a publication intended for women's interests in 1849, The Lily. Unfortunately, in Council Bluffs, there were no publishing facilities, so she sold The Lily after 1854 to another publisher. But in that publication, in addition to advocating for suffrage and other women's issues, she advocated for a freer kind of style of clothing for women. It was modest. It was a kind of overskirt over bloomers, and because she popularized it, it takes her name. This is what she said about it. Women's clothing should be suited to their wants and necessities. Should conduce to their health, comfort, and usefulness. And just so that you know what she was dealing with here, people made fun of the Bloomer costume in political cartoons, and I've seen dozens of them actually that tend to seem to indicate that women are trying to be men. They're smoking cigars, they're standing like men. Respectable women won't look at them. You know, even dogs are looking askance at them. But I want you to understand that in an era where women were expected to stay at home, their fashions suited that. This is admittedly an extreme costume, but this is a wealthy woman who needs two people to put a dress on over her vast petticoats. I've read accounts of women standing too close to fireplaces and catching fire before they realized it because their clothes started so far away from them. These are clothes that it's not coincidentally intended to keep women in the home. They can't go through doorways, they can't get in carriages, they can't sweep along dirty streets in these. And I also wanted to show you, this is a British woman, but I wanted to show you what was considered the model, the ideal form or figure for this era. Again, this woman doesn't have as many petticoats, but she also can't stand up. That perfect hourglass figure, would keep women from doing it. This Bloomer costume was an extremely important reform that is related to what women were expected to do. And that's what Bloomer is best known for, but the reason that I especially have her in this presentation is that she was president of an organization we'll talk about in a minute, from 1871 to 1873, and she advocated for suffrage until her death in the late 1880s. So I also wanted to mention an African-American woman whose story literally fascinates me. Charlotta Piles and her husband, who had been a free man in Kentucky where they had lived and had had 12 children, were given their freedom when their owner in Kentucky died. He left them to his daughter, who tried hard to emancipate them, but her brothers resented this loss of what they considered their property, and she became convinced that her safety was at risk, and so were the Piles family. So she made arrangements to take this significant, large family out of Kentucky and to Minnesota. But they arrived about the time winter was starting in Keokuk in 1854 and ended up settling there. The palimpsest, the Iowa Historical Society's journal, published an article written by Charlotta Piles' granddaughter in 1927. You can Google that if you're interested. This woman had had to leave one son behind. He had been kidnapped by that dead owner's sons. She never saw him again. But two of her daughters were married and had children, and their husbands were slaves. She went east at great personal peril and trouble to give speeches in Philadelphia and other eastern cities, where she raised $3,000 to buy the freedom of her sons-in-law. All of this in the 1850s, before, again, the Civil War and before slavery ended. So I want you to know about Charlotta Piles. We don't have a lot of information about African-American men or women before the mid-century, but this is a woman worth knowing about and someone Iowans can be justly proud of. In the 1860s, I'll stop after this in a second, but in the 1860s, there were some changes contemplated to the Iowa State Constitution. The Civil War and those new constitutional amendments caused a constitutional committee to be appointed by the governor in 1866. And by 1868, that committee had pushed through a bill in the Iowa legislature that deleted the word white from the Iowa Constitution. I can't tell you that this made always a practical difference, but Iowa was one of the first states that had designated citizenship by race to eliminate this in 1868. And a lot of women found that they had hopes that they could eliminate the word man in the Iowa State Constitution. And so there was a lot of agitation by the end of the 1860s to try to persuade the legislature to go further in amending the Constitution. As a part of that, the Northern Iowa Women's Suffrage Association was founded in Dubuque in 1869. They sent delegates to a Western suffrage convention in Chicago. One of the delegates was Dubuque citizen Mary Newberry Adams, who is a legend in the early Iowa suffrage movement. I hate to tell you that for various reasons we're about to talk about, by the mid-1870s, momentum to taking out the word man from the Iowa Constitution had just stalled. It'll rise again around the turn of the century, but one good thing came out of this agitation, and that was the designation of white men only as citizens. The white definition was struck. One more thing before I stop for questions. I thought this was interesting. Ellen Maurer is not known as one of the leading suffragists in the period, but she has a diary entry in 1869 where she described talking with a man she ran into who was very hard against women voting. She said his only argument was because. And she said that she was tickled at him in the evening when it was raining, that he said, "Well, Miss Maurer, now how would you like to be out in the rain at a women's rights convention?" And I said to him, "The rain is pure. It comes down from heaven, you know, refreshes and revives all things." So she had an answer for him. We don't know much about this Boone County resident except for this diary entry. She was clearly interested in suffrage, whether she became an activist or not. Now I'm going to stop, see if there are any questions. I don't see any in chat. I know that I'm getting The light is fading here. Look spectral. All right, and I'm going to keep going. So in the 1870s, Nettie Sanford should appear a little bit later. I didn't catch that. The Iowa Woman Suffrage Association was founded in 1870. So that was a statewide organization. That's the one that Amelia Bloomer serves as president of over the next several years. Here's a newspaper article in the Register that describes a lecture given in Waterloo about women's place in society in Iowa. And you can't read this, but basically I want you to know that by the 1870s, whether woman's place was only in the home was being debated and reported in news journals. But one of the things that complicates things in the 1870s, and I don't have time to spend a lot on this, but it's pretty fascinating, is a controversy about women being able to choose their own sexual partners in or out of marriage. As it was argued, men had always been able to do. This is known as the free love controversy, and it becomes a national issue because of a pastor in New York, one of a famous family. You probably heard of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Henry Ward Beecher was her half-brother and was a prominent pastor. He had actually served as president of that more conservative women's suffrage association, the American Women's Suffrage Association. He had been accused by Theodore Tilton of having seduced Elizabeth Tilton, Theodore's wife, and this dragged out for years. There were church trials, there were 2 civil trials. Beecher was never found guilty, but part of that was that Elizabeth Tilton was not, her word was not accepted in a court of law, takes 2, and she was not allowed to testify. It's very confusing, and I'm not going to spend much more time on it here, but I will tell you that Elizabeth Tilton first said that the affair had happened. She took that back later, and then she said it had happened again. So it's a mess. But what it does and how it relates to Iowa and to the suffrage movement generally is that men particularly, and some women who opposed women's access to the vote, argued that this is what's going to happen if you let women loose. If you let them outside that domestic sphere, look how the home is going to be destroyed. Here's this pastor who had been president of a women's suffrage association. This is going to destroy the family. So it doesn't help things when a New York woman, Victoria Woodhull, who happens to be the first American woman to run for president in 1872, gave speeches in 1871 saying that Elizabeth Tilton should have the right to sleep with whomever she wanted to. It was a human right. Even Elizabeth Cady Stanton that same year basically argued that women should have the same privileges and rights of any man. Boy, does that roil the waters, and especially in Iowa. Annie Savory, who was a Des Moines suffrage activist and who was not a proponent of free love, did write multiple letters to many newspapers in the state of Iowa. There's one in the Des Moines Register. It wasn't called then, it was the State Register at that time, but that is like 3.5 columns long, where she says basically that she doesn't support free love, but that this should not overshadow the need for women to have political equality. And just going that far, Nettie Sanford, whose name you see, I don't have a picture of her, but she argued in 1871 at the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association that the organization should pass a moral purity resolution, kind of taking its distance from this whole situation. And going even further than that, Martha Callahan, Callanan, actually denounced Annie Savory for not going far enough in denouncing free love. So through the 1870s, this was a mess. It distracted from the issue of suffrage itself, and was another, like the problems with race, it was another issue that really roiled the waters. Temperance becomes another issue that affects suffrage. Temperance as a word means, being temperate or moderate, but it comes to mean prohibition or complete abstinence from alcohol. The founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Annie Wittenmeyer, was an Iowa woman. She was not a proponent of suffrage, but she's worth knowing about too. She was a nurse during the Civil War. She supervised nurses. She founded orphan homes for orphans after the Civil War, and she was a prominent advocate for ending the sale of alcohol in Iowa and in the United States. Now, she founds the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874. Within 5 years, another woman whose picture I'm not going to show, Frances Willard, takes over that organization and builds it into the largest organization of American women in our history to that date. But I did want to mention to you that one of Wittenmeyer's aides, Mary Darwin, was a believer in temperance, but was also a believer in suffrage. I don't have a picture of her. Weirdly enough, her home is in the National Register of Homes, so I can show you where she lived, but I can't show you what she looked like. Just a moment to connect the dots here, why temperance is an issue in suffrage. In many areas of this country, not in Iowa, but in some states, usually in the states that have been colonies before our independence, we had inherited legal thought. Some of you have heard of, I'm blanking out just a second, of Sir William Blackstone. He was a jurist and legal philosopher in Great Britain. If you go to law school, Deb is here. She can tell you that a lot of our law is based on the Blackstone commentaries. Sorry. Guys. Good time to stop for a break, I assume. The Blackstone commentaries, William Blackstone had argued that women should be covered under the law by heads of household. He coined a term called coverture, which meant that women were represented by the head of their household, whether it's the father, the guardian, the husband, for finances, for obeying laws, for voting. They couldn't sue or be sued in coverture states. They couldn't testify in a court of law. They weren't considered whole persons under the law. So, and I'm cutting to the chase here because we don't have a lot of time to spend on temperance, but in that kind of situation, can you understand how a drunken husband could bankrupt a family and a woman would have no recourse? She could not sue in a court of law for separation or divorce or for support. She could lose custody of her children. Even money that she had contributed to the marriage was under her husband's control. So a lot of women and activists came to the suffrage issue, the right to vote, to even this unequal situation. So this is going to be a growing issue, and I will tell you right now that people who opposed temperance tended to oppose women's suffrage because it was widely believed that if women got the right to vote, they would vote to end the sale of alcohol. So the 1880s, a new publication was founded, began publication in 1886. The Woman's Standard. The Historical Society has actually torn copies of the first issue that you could look at when it's open again to view. A longtime editor of this was another suffrage activist, Mary Jane Whitley Coggeshall. She began publishing this in Des Moines. Over the course of its publication era, it was published in different cities in Iowa. In the 1890s, see, we are moving ahead. There's an increase in what were known as General Federation of Women's Clubs. Now, there were different other clubs as well, but you had a real burgeoning of women joining educational clubs. Sometimes they named them, I've come across references in Iowa that they named them more generally so that it didn't give away the fact that they promoted suffrage. But here is a book published by the General Federation of Women's Clubs in Iowa, readings and recitations, which included songs about suffrage, poems, and essays. Here is the first record of that organization in Iowa. It was founded in 1893. And at the first meeting, you can't see this here, but at the first meeting, a suffrage activist addressed the General Federation of Women in Iowa and said that they were so naive, she felt like a lion among lambs. But this is going to lead to more women being exposed to arguments about suffrage and to opportunities to get involved. In 1894, there was a little bit of a gain. Women gained limited suffrage. They couldn't vote for political candidates, but they could vote on issues like taxes and bond issues. So there's a little bit of activity, but there's still a lot of frustration by the end of that decade. And I'll tell you that no less a personage than Susan B. Anthony herself wrote to one of her friends in Iowa that the legislature was playing a cat and mouse game with suffragists and needed to stop. So that was in an 1897 letter. The next person I want to talk about is someone who came to prominence in the 1890s. This is Carrie Chapman Catt. She's probably the most famous Iowan to be active in suffrage. She had gone to college at what is now Iowa State. She wanted to be a teacher. Her father would not support her entirely. He wouldn't support her at all at first. She made her way through college by washing dishes, working in the library, and teaching in rural schools. She was the only woman to graduate in her year from Iowa State. She married a journalist in 1885. He took a job in California, and before she could join him, he had died of typhoid fever. She remarried in 1890, George Catt, and at that marriage in 1890, her second one, she had a prenup. She had become interested in suffrage, and George had to sign a document saying that she didn't have to take care of him for 4 months out of every year. He gave her permission to work for suffrage. So here's a picture of her on the left with Anna Howard Shaw, who's one of the early presidents of NAWSA. Chapman Catt is on the right. The Time magazine cover, I think, shows a kind of quirky personality. This was in 1926, sometime later. And that pin that you see at the bottom of the screen is a memento of an organization she helped found in 1904, an International Women's Suffrage Association. So just briefly, I'm going to tell you that Catt worked in the campaign to get South Dakota women the right to vote in 1890, the year of her second marriage. That failed. She went to Colorado to work for Colorado's passage of that amendment, which succeeded. And there's a really interesting account of her wild and crazy time in Colorado. She had to go to remote areas by traveling on one of those little hand carts on railways. And the man who was guiding her around corners and through valleys and up hills told her when she arrived at her dedication not to forget that it was a man who had gotten her there, not a woman. Colorado passed the state suffrage amendment in 1893. By 1900, she was elected president of NAWSA. Her husband, George Catt, became ill, and she resigned that office in 1904, but she came back in 1915 and was president of NAWSA until the suffrage amendment passed in 1920. After this, and you can still see that she was active in the 1920s, she founded the League of Women Voters, which is still active in educating voters today. So we owe a lot to Catt, and I'm going to stop and see if there are questions. I don't, honestly, we just have a few more slides, don't panic. Anybody have a question about any of that? I'm assuming that most of you have heard of Carrie Chapman Catt. I had already shown you a picture of her. There's a popular culture movie that was made by HBO called Iron-Jawed Angels. Our library has a copy of it. It portrays Catt pretty negatively, which I think is unfair, but it's a fictionalized film, and it portrays Alice Paul, her kind of opponent in tactics in the 19-teens, much more favorably. But I show it in my classes because it's powerful. It also has some scenes with an actress who portrays Ida Wells Barnett, whom Keisha talked about last week. So pressing on, in the 20th century, we don't have that much more to go. There are some changes in the participation of African American women in Iowa. In the late 19th century, the turn of the century, there were segregated organizations, the Iowa State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, who did similar activities and education on suffrage with their membership. The Bystander, or the Iowa Bystander, which was an African American newspaper that was published twice a month starting in 1894, did frequent updates on African American suffrage leaders. It's not very easy to read here, but I did want to highlight three of them. Helena Downey of Ottumwa, who is extremely significant in the Iowa suffrage movement among African Americans. Sue Brown, who is married to an attorney, G. Joe Brown in Des Moines, really had a national presence in suffrage. And we know of women such as Fannie Wilson Cooper. This is her obituary. She's not on any list I've ever found of African American women who were suffragists, but her daughter saved a number of condolence notes that people had written her when her husband died, and then had written her daughter when Cooper herself died. And a lot of those notes came from organizations that were African American suffrage organizations. So the assumption is, although we haven't seen her name, the assumption is that she was an important player too. After 1900, there's increasing demand among people who want temperance for women to have the right to vote. And I've seen newspaper articles and reports in the Iowa legislature of literally hundreds of petitions coming from different counties and towns demanding that the Iowa legislature grant women the right to vote so that Iowa will be safe in terms of outlawing drunkenness and drinking. So I won't show you any of those records, but this becomes really a pressing issue. In the heartland, in the city that the Evangelical Free Church was founded in, Boone, Iowa, there was a suffrage parade on October 29th, 1908. And I've seen estimates of between, certainly over 100 people marched in this parade. There was a band, there were banners. I've seen estimates of up to 150 people in this suffrage parade who marched. And if that's happening in the heartland, you know that something's up. Anna Howard Shaw, who became president of NASA after Carrie Chapman Catt's resignation in 1904. She was a physician as well as an ordained minister. She didn't like this kind of outward activism or parades and that kind of thing. She initially refused to come to the parade, but you can see her barely there in the middle addressing the crowd. Lucy, sorry, Lucy, stop. Addressing the crowd, she's standing on the seat of one of those newfangled automobiles and giving an address. In addition to Anna Howard Shaw, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw's presence, there were two British radical suffragettes who had visited the United States and then came to Boone's parade. And I want to mention something about language here. I don't think it's always understood that usually in the United States, suffrage activists were called suffragists, IST. Sometimes it was abbreviated to suffs. In Britain, they were usually called suffragettes. So usually American activists were not referred to by that "et" title, but two suffragettes came to Boone to participate in this parade, which again was a pretty significant thing. It was the brainchild of Rowena Edson Stevens and Eleanor Elizabeth Gordon. And Gordon was a Unitarian, ordained Unitarian pastor, as was Stevens. And the two of them had been active in the state organization and in their local suffrage organizations for years. Particularly Gordon published this. She said, "I came home from a meeting where we listened to an earnest paper written by an earnest woman, read in an earnest manner, giving good and sufficient reasons why women were entitled to vote. All of us had believed in this doctrine since the day of our birth, so there was no answering thrill as the earnest voice went on its earnest way." And she said that it was so hot, this was a meeting in August in Iowa, so hot that a salamander would have fried on the sidewalk. Stop it, stop it. She said, "As I walked slowly home over the hot and dusty pavement, I said to myself, something must be done and done quickly, or we shall learn to hate this whole business. Something is wrong with our propaganda, or else it wouldn't be true that only a half dozen of already convinced women will attend a suffrage meeting." So this was a new kind of tactic where women were definitely getting outside of their homes and acting in public. In 1910, this postcard was prominent at the state fair outside of Des Moines in 1810, showing again that newfangled automobile with a woman driving it. And again, showing a kind of more updated, modern tactic of the new generation. And I thought it was funny that Carrie Dean Pruin, who's a native of Tipton, and there she is in the 1890s with her newfangled safety bicycle, after her marriage, had a Buick bought for her by her husband, and she used to drape a banner over her Buick and drive around rural Iowa. And she said later in some accounts of her life, she said that she used to drive around and argue with farmers who kept telling her that a woman's place was only in the home. So Carrie Dean Pruin is another activist, and again, using these kinds of updated technological advances. In 1912 and 1913, there were automobile rallies by suffragists. This got a lot of attention in Iowa, where the automobile, again, was very new, a novelty, and called a lot of attention to this. In 1915 and 1916, and we really are nearing the end here, so bear with me. In 1915 and 1916, there were significant developments. In 1915, the state legislature set a vote for June of 1916 for passing suffrage in Iowa. And there was a whole lot of agitation on both sides. The anti-temperance people were hot to keep women from having the right to vote. The pro-suffrage people posted billboards everywhere. The Woman's Journal sent out free copies of its magazine, of its newspaper, to 60 different newspapers for them to, in Iowa, for them to pull out information about suffrage, and made free copies available throughout the state for 3 months of their publication. There were all kinds of propaganda: vote yes, give us the ballot. This was actually a song written by a woman who had recently moved from California to Iowa. She wrote a lot of different lyrics and music on behalf of suffrage. Flora Dunlap was a woman who was harassed by 2 drunk men when she was standing outside the legislature, advocating for suffrage in June of 1916. And they didn't make her go away. But unfortunately, That bill was defeated. This report, our headline says by 5,000 people. And again, this would be all men. In fact, it was twice that. 10,000 men, more men voted against suffrage than for suffrage. So this was a big disappointment to the pro-suffrage people. And the Iowa WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, those temperance activists, published this map showing the counties, the districts whose representatives voted for it, that's yellow. Those who voted against are represented by the white areas. And then they had this little legend attached to it. These little triangles that you see in the map show where the WCTU found irregularities in voting. We talk a lot about that in our own culture. And so you can't read this, but more people voted than were on the rolls, various kinds of irregularities. The WCTU thought this was a fake vote. So by June of 1916, things are looking dark. But in April 1919, the state legislature allowed women to vote for president, not any local public office. And on July 2nd, 1919, Iowa becomes the 10th state, after both the House and the Senate had passed the amendment, the 10th state to ratify. And remember, it's going to take another year before Tennessee becomes the last 46th state. But here is the Speaker of the House in Iowa, Harge McFarland, and then the Governor of Iowa in the center. Harge McFarland is here on the right. The Governor of Iowa, William Harding, is pictured giving an address to the joint houses of the Iowa Congress. And so this is a huge jubilee, as one of the suffrage activists said. It was a celebration, a jubilee, a perfect joy. So Iowa is number 10 among the 36 states that ratify the Anthony or 19th Amendment. And so we have to wait another 13 months before this is a national, before it's added to the Constitution. But after April of 1919 and then July of 1919, women could vote for everything in Iowa. Questions about any of this? Tried to skip through some of this a little bit faster. And I hope you're able to kind of put it in the context of what I shared that was happening nationally. You know, the war had ended in November of 1918. So about 5 months later, Iowa women could vote for president. And by July 2nd, 1919, Iowa women had the right to vote across the board. But it came at great cost, at great effort, and with a lot of discouragement. So I will stop there and see if you have questions. My spectral image there in the dark. Take a little Diet Coke sip. If you think about it nationally, from the Declaration of Independence in 1776 to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, that was 72 years. From Seneca Falls to the 19th Amendment being ratified, it was another 72 years. So depending on how you count, either 72 years or 144 years for women to get the right to vote in this country. My maternal grandmother, I'm old, but my mother was the next to last of 10 children. And my maternal grandmother was born in 1885, and she had the right to vote by the time she was 35 years old. Despite the fact that she had been married, had had a child, she was pregnant with a second child. Her husband and her firstborn child died of fever, and she gave birth to her second child, left that with her parents, my aunt, with her parents, so that she could get a teaching certificate to support her family as the head of the household. She remarried and had 8 more children, including my mother, but she was 35 before she had the right to vote in this country. That's not really that long ago in terms of generations. I saw a chat question pop up. The question is, did the suffragists then support more temperance? And I did not get to this. I'm sorry, Lucy wants to go outside. I did not get to this in the talk, but in 1919, this became a moot issue when the Volstead Act, or the 18th Amendment passed and was ratified and became part of the Constitution. That will be revoked in 1933 by yet another constitutional amendment. Prohibition did not succeed, but the temperance issue faded away after 1919 because prohibition had already been voted in. Does that make sense?
Allison.
Yes, ma'am. Sir.
So Catt's prenup is rather interesting. So was it common that some of the men like took it to court if their women didn't take care of them? Or I thought it was really interesting that she put that in the prenup. And so
and apparently he agreed to that. A lot of this is interesting, Joe, because a lot of the 19th century, particularly the 19th century activists, married men who supported their equality. So for instance, Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell were two of the founders of that more conservative suffrage organization in 1869. And they deliberately wrote their vows to leave out obey. And they read jointly a statement about how marriage was oppressive to women. They agreed on that. And so he made it clear from the very beginning of their marriage that, he supported women's suffrage, and he was a founding member of the suffrage organization. So it varied, of course, from person to person. Mary Darwin, I told you about as the temperance advocate and suffragist. She and her husband divorced at some point during her activism, so that, it didn't always work out amicably. But I know more stories about these women who were particularly on the forefront, who deliberately either chose not to marry. Susan B. Anthony had opportunities, but said she would not. She would either be a doll or a drudge, or who chose partners who would support them. Any other questions? I don't want to keep you any longer. I know we went a little over and you had to listen to some barking. Here's another question. What role did state governments play in extending voting rights to women? And what role did, I didn't see the rest of that, Brandy. Let me see, pull it up. And what role did the federal government play? Well, you're right to distinguish those efforts. States could allow women to vote in their states. Remember, 4 Western states had allowed that by 1896. 15 states had allowed it in the Union by 1913. But the federal law, the constitutional amendment, made it mandatory across the board. So it might be similar, and I don't want to get into too much comparison here, but it might be similar to fairly recently in our past when certain states allowed same-sex marriage, and then it became part of federal policy. So you might go to Vermont or go to California if you wanted to marry someone of your sex, and that is now legal in 50 states. Does that help maybe a little? I think that was Brandy's question. Is that right? Well, if you have any other questions, email me. I love to talk about this stuff, as you can tell, and I'll talk your ear off. So I really enjoyed this. Thank you for bearing with me. And Lucy and Trudy, thank you too. Stay safe, stay well, stay strong. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, Allison. That was marvelous. Thank you.